It was the autumn of 1967, in the northwestern corner of Kontum province, in the part of the Central Highlands where South Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia come together and not one of the three borders is drawn on the ground. Almost all of that country is mountain. Almost all of the mountain stands under forest in tiers, and on the floor of it a man can see 15 or 20 feet in front of him. The hills up there did not have names. On the maps the soldiers carried they had numbers, and the number was the height of the hill in meters above the sea. 823, 882, 1,338. For 37 days, American and South Vietnamese units climbed them, one after another. The climbing went much the same way each time. A ridge going up under closed trees, bunkers and trenches already dug along the crest, cut into the ground and roofed with timber. A fight for the crest, and then the top, and on the top, most times, nobody at all. The men who had built those positions had chosen the ground, had fought from it, and had gone. One of the hills was numbered 875. The fight on it lasted 6 days, and it is the one the battle is remembered by. This is the complete story of Dak To. A month of climbing in the highlands and the men who did the climbing. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps the Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. An episode like this one takes weeks of reading and assembling, and that one small tap genuinely keeps the watch going. Now get comfortable. There is no hurry in any of this, and nothing in the next 2 hours needs to be remembered. We are going to start where the men on the ground had to start, with the country itself, the way the ranges run, the forest that stands over them, and the one dirt strip at the bottom of the valley. Kontum province lies in the northwestern corner of the Second Corps Zone. It covers close to 10,000 square kilometers, which makes it one of the larger provinces in the country, and about 100,000 people lived in it. Most of that 100,000 lived along the 2 roads and the river bottoms. The rest of the province, the great majority of its area, had no roads in it and no towns, and it was where the fighting of that autumn took place. The border corner itself is the reason the province mattered. On paper, 3 countries end there. On the ground there is a ridge, and behind it another ridge, and the map says the country ends along one of them. There is no line out there, no fence, no marker. In the same corner lay a base area that American reports called Military Station North, where the trail out of the north came down into the highlands. The ground had been fought over before. In February of 1954, the Viet Minh came at the French post northwest of Kontum City in battalion strength and destroyed them, and within the week, the French had given up the provincial capital. The French post at Dak To was taken that same year. It stood a few kilometers from the place where the American base of the same name would later grow. Dak To is in the western part of the province. The valley it sits in runs west to east, out of Laos into Kontum, and an old colonial road, Route 512, runs its whole length. It is one of the few places in the Western Highlands where crossing the border was easy walking. North of the road, the ground is level for a little way. South of it, level ground gives out. Beyond that, the country turns into a run of high ridges and narrow valleys, and most of them lie north to south. Some of those valleys lead toward the Cambodian border. A few of the ridges carry names in the reports. Rocket Ridge, a long line of summits south of the old Dak To airfield, and a favored place to shoot rockets from. and west of it a smaller knot of peaks called Nok Dorlong. Getting there from Pleiku meant Highway 14 north through Kontum City, then a turn west onto 512. 14 is hard-surfaced and runs down the eastern side of the region. North of Dak To it deteriorates quickly, and by the camp at Dak Pek, there is effectively no road at all. That camp lived on what an aircraft brought it. Foot trails, on the other hand, are everywhere. Route 512 begins at Tan Khan and runs west toward the border. It was the only land route into the region, and it worked while the ground was dry. Off it and off the airfield, there was no other way of bringing anything in at all. On the east, the region is closed off by the Krong Poko. It is the main obstacle to movement across the grain of the country, and in the dry season a man can wade it. The Dak Poko runs through the middle of the ground and counted for lest. Most of the work went on southwest of it. On the west, there is no river, only the border. Water runs everywhere else in smaller quantities. Streams and small rivers come down off the high ground in numbers, and what flat and thinly grown land there is follows them, along the Krong Poko and up the floors of the valleys. Away from the water, the ground begins to rise almost at once. A man who stepped off a valley floor was climbing inside a few hundred meters, and he stayed on a slope until he came out on a crest. The mountains go above 2,400 feet and they are covered. The canopy is closed and stands in several tiers. Hardwoods reaching 60 meters in the country south of Dak To, and under them a second story of bamboo and vine and scrub taking whatever light the crowns let through. Apart from the valleys, 9/10 of the high ground is forest of that kind. Clearings marked on the military maps often turned out to be bamboo, standing 50 or 60 feet and packed too close to walk through. Spurs come down off the ridges into the narrow valleys, steep and slippery, and a great many of them were never drawn on any map at all. There are mountain caves in the region, and a good number of them. 15 or 20 feet was the working figure for what a man could see down there. The general description in the report says a few yards. From the air it could be done, but only if the observer flew low enough to look in under the canopy, which is lower than most flying is done. Inside the forest, the air did not move. The animals were often silent, in the wary way animals are silent when something is walking. The damp never left, so the floor of the place was permanently rotting and permanently soft. Along Highway 14 north of Kontum City, a man could see 4 kilometers to either side. Past that it was forest. Temperatures over the period ran between 55 and 91 degrees. Afternoons on the high ground were hot, and the nights up there were cold. The staff wrote afterward that the weather had worked in their favor, because it stopped nothing they wanted to do. Not the flying, not the ammunition, not the moving of men. The canopy did things to gunnery as well. Mortar rounds and light artillery shells often burst in the crowns, 100 feet up, and what came through to the ground was a good deal less than what had been fired. Flat trajectory fire was limited in these mountains, and the undergrowth turned it aside. Radio worked badly among the ridges. Helicopters could not always reach where they were wanted. The forest closes over what is done to it, and quickly. In a fresh crater, the savanna grass was up within a day. In a week, there was undergrowth standing in it. In a month, the crater was hard to find again. The same growth hid movement from the eye and from the camera both. The country did not keep a record of anything that happened on it. Soldiers looked at country like this for a short list of things: The base at Dak To sits between two ridge systems, one to the north of it and one to the south and southwest. And whoever held those crests could look down into the base and drop things onto it. 15 kilometers to the southwest, two trail systems cross each other, and a single hill stands over the crossing. In October and November, the region lies under the northeast monsoon, and in this part of the highlands, the northeast monsoon is the dry half of the year. Surface wind comes out of the northeast and the east at 7 to 12 knots, gusting to 20. Across the whole of that autumn period, rain fell on one day. The ground stayed dry and vehicles moved on it easily. Mornings began with fog. It stood in the deep valleys and along the streams, and it went off as the sun got onto it. Visibility on an ordinary day ran 7 to 10 miles. Early in the morning it came down to about 1. Cloud lay in layers well above the ridges. By the middle of the day the sky was usually open, and it stayed open. West of the district town of Kontum, on the north side of the valley, there was a post the size of a battalion. It had been there since the early 60s. Alongside it lay a small strip, long enough for helicopters and for the light observation aircraft that worked the valley. And in the staff papers, the place went by a plain name: the old Dak To airfield. Kontum itself was held by a South Vietnamese battalion of the 42nd Regiment. 3 kilometers west of the old field, there was a second one, newer and larger, with a hard surface strip that could take a C-130. The village the whole complex was named for stood about 5 kilometers away. The new field sat in a hole. High mountains closed it on all 4 sides, and from the strip itself, a man could see up, and that was about all. It had been put there because the valley floor was the only flat ground in the district, not because it was a good place for a field, and everything awkward about it afterwards came from that one fact. Defense of the whole area came to 3 military camps and half a dozen fire bases, strung along Route 512 on the north side of the valley. The Special Forces camp at Dak To was the communications node for all of them. Its field wire was laid on the surface at first, until construction equipment cut it. Buried after that, it came up again near the command post and ran through the elephant grass. The grass burned from time to time and took the line with it. Those camps belonged to a program with an unwieldy name, the Civilian Irregular Defense Group. It had started as a pilot project around a village called Buonanao in Darlak Province. Development centers put down in remote districts where the government reached weakly or not at all, with American Special Forces teams working through Vietnamese counterparts to raise a defense that the villages would man themselves. The Raid were the first people the program went to. They were reckoned the most influential of the hill peoples and the most usefully placed, and the estimates put them at something over 100,000. They had lived on the high plateau for centuries and built their houses and their rice fields near the rivers and the springs, and it was their elders the first Americans in the highlands sat down with. By 1964, the program had moved out toward the western borders of the country. The irregular companies were recruited mostly from Montagnard and Khmer communities. They were armed lightly, and their training was brief. A camp of that period held a Special Forces detachment and something like 400 irregulars behind its wire. Dak To was one of the links in that chain, and it was an old link. In June of 1963, 4 strike companies drawn from Dak To, Plei Morong, and Polei Krong were put together for a single operation, so the camp was in business by then at the latest. Other camps in the province lay out around it, most of a day apart by any road that existed. Dak Xiang and Dak Pek to the north up the failing highway, Mong Buk away to the east, Pole Kleng and Pole Krong down toward Pleiku. On the books they were all carried through a detachment at Kontum town and a company headquarters at Pleiku. The word Montagnard is a collective the way the word Indian is. It covers more than 100 hill peoples across Indochina. In South Vietnam there were some 29 tribes and more than 200,000 people. Custom and language varied from one village to the next inside a single tribe. And what they had in common was that life was built around the village, and that the fields were cut and burned out of the forest and then moved. The Highlands had been a separate country for a long time, held apart by geography and by economics from the developed parts of Vietnam. The ground the hill people occupied had value to anyone who wanted the interior. The French had recruited and trained them as soldiers, and a good many had served. In the Dak To area, there was a Montagnard agricultural school, and the American units in the valley looked after it. West along 512, past the last of the old positions, a new place was being opened. The camp at Dak To was being moved out there, to a clearing called Ben Het, and by late October of 1967, an engineer company was on the ground. A strip first, sized for the small transports, but laid out so that it could be widened later, and space cleared for the camp itself. Ben Het had been sited to a requirement. It stood within 15 kilometers of the Laotian border, which put it close enough that heavy American guns based there could reach across the line, and later that autumn, a fire base was built on the site for the 175mm pieces of the 52nd Artillery Group. The move was never quite finished. The old camp at Dak To went on working. On the far side of the border, a headquarters had been made for this sector. In 1964, Hanoi set up a separate combat command for the Highlands, the B3 Front, under Major General Chu Huy Man, and it became the largest North Vietnamese headquarters outside the North. Under it, by the American reckoning, were 6 maneuver regiments in 2 divisions, and behind them a system of rear installations. Those installations were supply complexes with a name of their own: hospitals, storage, rest houses, plots of rice. The routes running to them lay for the most part along province and district boundaries, in country where government forces rarely operated, and where clearing a fire mission took the agreement of 2 headquarters at least. Fighting in the Highlands through 1965 and 1966 ran along the chain of special forces camps, stretched down the Laotian border. In June of 1966, the 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division went after the 24th North Vietnamese Regiment in Kontum Province in an operation called Hawthorne, and stopped it directly north of Dak To. The regiment was handled roughly and it was not broken. It went back into Laos and reformed. There was not a great deal in the Highlands to do that kind of work with. In the autumn of 1966, the field force commander had 6 infantry battalions, a tank battalion, and a divisional armored cavalry squadron for the whole of the interior, which is a little less than a division. Artillery had begun arriving that summer, a group into Pleiku, with battalions parceled out to the 4th Infantry Division. By the first week of October 1967, the 4th Division was covering Kontum with a single mechanized battalion. Responsibility for the isolated camps was the division's, and its ground took in most of Kontum and Pleiku provinces, and the north of Darlock. In the course of that year, every one of the camps in western Kontum was threatened at least once. In May, with the rain starting, American intelligence reckoned that the strength in the base area beyond the border was growing. By how much? The reporting of that spring does not say. The camps stood where they had always stood. The strip below them took whatever the aircraft brought in, and nothing else about the place changed. The shelling along Highway 14 began in the first days of June 1967 on the stretch of road around Ton Con. On the night of the 10th, local units fired on 5 Allied installations around the city of Pleiku, in a district quiet for about half a year. On the 13th, a company from a battalion known as the K-101D struck an irregular defense company 20 kilometers southwest of Ton Con. 2 days later, the same battalion broke up a Special Forces mobile guerrilla force nearby. From the 15th of June, 2 American advisors and several of the irregulars with them were carried as missing. Early on the 17th, a battalion of the 24th Regiment put 50 mortar rounds into the compound of the 24th Special Tactical Zone in the city of Kontum. 3 hours later, a 2nd Battalion of the same regiment, with a battalion of the 40th Artillery, fired on the South Vietnamese headquarters at Ton Con and on the Special Forces camp at Dak To. Of the 100 bursts counted at Ton Con, 4 were rockets of 122 millimeters. Of the 60 counted at Dak To, 10 were mortar rounds of 120. Nothing of that caliber had been fired anywhere in the 2nd Corps zone before. That day, General Pierce ordered a battalion of the 173rd Airborne Brigade into the camp at Dak To, 5 kilometers west of Ton Con. He expected the fighting for the Highlands to shift north into Kontum. Over the following day, the brigade commander, General Dean, came up behind the battalion with his headquarters and a second one. One battalion went looking for the men missing since the 15th. The other worked through the jungle for the mortar and rocket positions that had fired on the camps. The operation was given the name Greeley, and it was the brigade's first work in these mountains. June is the wet half of the year up there. Low cloud and fog held the summits until late in the morning, and rain, when it came, could run the whole day. The canopy closed overhead in layers, and a man on the ground could see a few yards into it and no further. On the evening of the 21st, Company A of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, was told to be back at Dak To by 3 the next afternoon. Captain Frederick Milton started his 141 men at 25 minutes past 6, earlier than ordered. Because the ground was slow, their work that day was a search 5 kilometers south of Dak To. At 2 minutes before 7, the lead squad, moving north down a ridge under a canopy that let very little sun through, saw several North Vietnamese soldiers below it, fired, and pulled back up the slope. A few hundred meters east behind the crest, a North Vietnamese battalion of 300 or 400 men was on the move. The battalion commander, Edward Partain, ordered the contact restored and pressed. The lead platoon came under automatic and small arms fire from the front and both flanks. At 10 minutes past 8, the first attack came in, at about platoon strength, and 40 minutes after that a heavier one followed. Artillery was called for at once, under a closed canopy. The shells burst in the crowns, and the fragments came down on the platoons that were still moving, so the fire had to be stopped until the reinforcing platoon was in place. That platoon got through about an hour later, with the first airstrikes and the gunships. Through the trees, neither did much. Milton was trying to do two things at once: bring the rest of the company forward and cut a clearing a helicopter could use. Only his first platoon got through. The second was pushed back, and what was left stood in two pockets on the ridge. Losses among the platoon leaders were such that the senior remaining sergeant took the cutoff group up the slope to the company command post. Partain sent up a company from 1.5 kilometers to the south and put the reserve company in from Dak To onto a clearing that would take one helicopter at a time. By midday, about 30 men were holding Milton's position, and the company that came in by helicopter was pushed back down the ridge by fire. The fight went on all day, and the losses were heavy. Later in the afternoon, as the reinforcements came up, the North Vietnamese broke contact and moved away. It was late in the evening before a landing zone could be cut, and the wounded lifted out. Company A's losses for the day came to 79 killed and 23 wounded. What the other side lost is only ever an American count: 18 found in the days afterwards, and a reported total for the action of 106, with 45 weapons taken. Nothing from the other side has ever been set beside those numbers. Dean's staff put together what the returning men and the air observers had seen, and concluded that one company had run into most of a regiment. From the rest of what intelligence held, the commanders drew a second conclusion. The brigade might shortly be facing 3 North Vietnamese regiments in country that sharply limited what artillery and aircraft could do for it. General Larson flew up from 1st Field Force on the 22nd to see Piers at Dak To. At about 9 the next morning, he telephoned General Tolson and asked for a battalion ready to move by 1 o'clock. The 2nd Battalion of the 12th Cavalry was pulled straight out of contact, moved in 24 sorties of C-130s, and was at Dak To by that evening with an artillery battery. It went into the hills almost at once. On the 10th of July, intelligence work brought the 4th Battalion of the 503rd onto a regimental headquarters 20 miles southwest of Dak To. Machine guns opened from concealed bunkers on a crest 35 meters from the lead company, which had no sight of them until they fired. 2 companies tried in turn to work around the flanks, and both were stopped. That fight ran several hours and ended the way these fights ended. An afternoon thunderstorm came over the ridge, and the North Vietnamese went out through it, leaving 22 Americans dead and 62 wounded. Next day, the paratroopers walked into a complex of mutually supporting bunkers, many under 2 feet of overhead cover, with nobody in it. The 2 weeks of sweeping that followed turned up fresh trails and abandoned camps, and no fight worth the name. In early August, above the camp at Dak Chiang, 4 days of fighting ended with the position taken and the regiment holding it gone into Laos. Rawson declared Greeley over on the 11th of October. Of the 8 large fights the 2 Highland operations had produced that summer, 7 had been inside 10 kilometers of the Cambodian or the Laotian border, close in against the bases on the far side of it. Piers grew more careful after that about fighting at the border. The province had taken a cavalry brigade for a month and the Airborne brigade for the best part of 4, along with a large piece of the South Vietnamese General Reserve. The ridge 5 kilometers south of Dak To stood where it had stood in June under the same trees, and the trails through it were fresh again by the end of the summer. Every year since 1965, the B-3 front had opened the dry season with a large attack somewhere in the western part of the 2nd Corps zone. By the end of October 1967, the question at 1st Field Force was not whether there would be another one. General Rosen had to decide where it would come and when. He had one recent case to reason from. In June, parts of the 1st North Vietnamese Division had fought the Airborne Brigade in the hills, south of Dak To, and the American estimate was built on that. The same thing again, on a larger scale. Everything else that could be said about the other side came from the air, from the radio, and from ground. The Americans walked over afterwards. By late October, the long-range patrols of the 4th Division and of 1st Field Force had found troops near the border, seen with the eye and reported. That was the plainest kind of evidence and the hardest to come by. A patrol covers what a few men can walk in a few days, and the country it was walking was a province of mountains. The rest came from cooking fires. Helicopters carrying air sampling equipment worked along the valleys for traces of smoke under the canopy. Mohawks of the 225th Aviation Company read the same fires from above with infrared, flying with the long radar pods slung under the fuselage. None of it showed a man. All of it showed that men were living in country where nobody lived. Radio research units of 1st Field Force picked up a run of transmissions from the headquarters of the 1st Division. Decoding gave the sense of them, and triangulation from aircraft packed with equipment gave the addressees. By the end of the month, the American command could say, within a few kilometers, where the regiments were being told to go. The 24th Regiment was somewhere north of Dak To. The 32nd and the 66th were somewhere west of it. There were reports that the 174th had stopped inside Laos, no further away than a day's march. Where any of them would be a week after that was not something an intercept could give. Behind those addresses stood the B-3 front under General Huang Minh Thao, which American intelligence put at about 15,000 fighting men, and made responsible for Kontum, Pleiku, and Darlok, and the western parts of 2 provinces beyond. 3 of the 4 regiments the intercepts had placed belonged to its 1st Division, under Colonel Nguyen Hu An. The 24th was carried separately, and so were a regiment in Pleiku and another in Darlok. The front also had an artillery regiment, the 40th, with rockets of 122 millimeters, mortars of 120, and recoilless guns. The regiment in Darlak was reported to be preparing something of its own, and Piers moved his 2nd Brigade down towards Ban Mae Thuot for a time on the strength of it. Piers had a standing job in the Highlands that had nothing to do with any of this. He was covering the provincial and district towns strung along Highway 14, and most of them sat 30 to 50 kilometers back from the border, which left a belt of empty mountain in between. Everything the reports were describing was happening inside that belt. On the 28th of October, 46 rockets of 122 millimeters came down on Pleiku. Nothing of that kind had been fired at that provincial capital before. A periodic intelligence report of 1st Field Force, covering the week that ended on the 21st, was among the papers behind the reading that settled afterwards on Dak To. The valley was the reason. Out of the depots on the far side of the border, it ran straight east into Kontum, with the old colonial road along its floor, and it was one of the very few doors into the Western Highlands that a man could walk through carrying a load. South of the road, the ridges took over, running north and south, and a force coming up any one of them was under trees the whole way. Nothing about that had changed in 20 years. What had changed was how much was now standing on the other side of the door. What the American staffs made of that was an assessment, not a fact. In their reading, the corridor was worth holding as a fast route for troops equipment and supply from the depots, and worth holding for a second reason. As long as it was contested, the Allies could not build up stocks at Dak To for anything of their own across the border. The second half of the reading had to do with the ground rather than the road. Fighting in broken country under closed forest took away part of what the American side was good at. In their assessment, a force that fought here fought where the American advantages counted for least, and it fought there by choice rather than by accident. Time was the other part of the reading. Almost nobody lived in that country, so soldiers carried nearly all their own supply. And what could be grown locally was little, and was sprayed from the air besides. A move of that size had to be prepared for weeks and months in advance. That preparation was exactly what the patrols and the fires and the intercepts had been finding. The positions in the hills were the same argument in a heavier form. Bunkers were roofed and walled with thick logs of mahogany cut in the forest around them. A grenade did nothing to one. Only a direct hit by a bomb or a shell would open it, and the trees were ironwood, cut by hand, so that a single bunker was days of work for the men who built it. They were not built singly. Bunkers went in by squads, tied together by trench systems, with firing slits low and narrow. Behind many of them ran a trench in a horseshoe, where the men inside could step back from the burst of a grenade. Tunnels connected some positions to others higher up the slope. On the crests there were storage places already stocked and complexes standing empty. Whatever had been carried up there had been carried up over a long time. Along the same valleys the patrols were watching, and it was in the ground before the first American company started climbing toward it. After the first weeks in the hills, the American assessment was that the quality of the bunker system said something further. Whoever had built them on one ridge had had time enough to build them on the next, in the valleys west of the camps as well. So the reading settled. The regiments were in the mountains north and west of the string of camps along Road 512. In numbers, the intelligence could give roughly, and in positions it could give only in part. The one thing about which there was no doubt at all was the ground. It ran the way it had always run, east out of Laos, north and south along the ridges, up to crests under a roof of trees that had never been cleared. The American command could choose which battalions to send and when to send them. It could not choose where they would be going. The after-action report of the 4th Infantry Division gives the battle a starting date. And the date is the 25th of October, 1967. From that day, the division counted its ammunition by the 24 hours, and the heavy clearing dozers began work along the road west of Ton Con. Nothing was fought over. The first shot of the battle would not be fired for another 9 days. What the Americans had in those 9 days was a direction, and not much else. Reports came in from the west and from the south, and none of them said where. In country like this, a unit finds the enemy by walking into him. Contact is a sound, and the sound gives the bearing. Everything done in the last week of October was done to have men standing where the sound might come from. On the 28th, General Pierce began building up the bases at Dak To. He had a mechanized battalion holding the valley, and he took it out and put in infantry that could fight in the mountains on foot. Engineers of the 299th went to work on Route 512, between Ton Con and Ben Het, the stretch that everything else would have to move over. That same day, a C-130 brought in the 3rd Battalion of the 12th Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel John Vollmer. The next flight, on the 29th, brought Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Belknap and the 3rd of the 8th. At the end of the month, Colonel Richard Johnson, who commanded the 1st Brigade of the 4th Division, opened a forward command post at Dak To and began running the fight from there. Nothing about those 9 days looked like a battle. Aircraft came in on schedule and went out empty. Men who had been on the coast a week before drew ammunition, filled canteens, and were told which valley they would be walking into. The staff summary for the period notes only that conditions allowed everything that was asked of them. General Rawson, commanding the 1st Field Force, added a battalion of paratroopers, the 4th of the 503rd. Lifted up from Tui Hoa on the coast, Johnson put them at Ben Het, the Special Forces camp at the western end of the road. 3 batteries of the 6th Battalion, 29th Artillery came in behind them. That move had begun on the 31st, with the battalion alerted in the middle of its own operation on the coast. At 11 in the morning on the 1st of November, the lead element flew out for Kontum by C-13, and the last of the battalion was on the ground at Dak To by 5:15 the following afternoon. The Airborne Brigade dated its own battle from that first day. On the 2nd, the American side got confirmation of what was standing in front of it. The estimate had been that an artillery attack was being prepared, and that by its own timetable the attack should already have come at the end of October, and had not. Piers, meaning to be moving before it did, told Johnson to start putting his infantry into the hills. The work was divided that afternoon. Belknap was to look at Nok Dorlong, a knot of peaks west of the airfield. Vollmer was to look at Rocket Ridge, the long line of high ground running south of Dak To 1. General Vin Lock agreed to place South Vietnamese battalions north of Dak To, and 4 squadrons of F-100s at Phu Cat, on the coastal plain, stood ready on call. On the morning of the 3rd, the helicopters took 2 companies of Vollmer's battalion 7 kilometers south and set them down on Rocket Ridge, about 1,500 meters below Hill 1338. That ridge was the ground the estimate had pointed at, and the 2 companies were put on it to find out whether anybody was on it. They found what they had come for that day. Elements of the 32nd Regiment were on the high ridge directly south of Dak To, and the first fighting of the battle happened there, about 900 meters from where one of the heaviest fights of the previous June had been. Vollmer pulled his companies back off the contact and let the aircraft and the guns work. Among what went in were 24,000-pound bombs with delayed fuses, set to go down through the canopy before they burst. It took several hours of that before the bunkers along the ridge were given up. The next day the sound came from 2 directions at once. Belknap's battalion, out on the ridges west of the airfield, was in against 2 battalions of the same regiment. Further west, in the valley below Ben Het, the paratroopers were in against the 66th. By the evening of the 4th, 2 regiments had been located in the hills around Dak To. That evening, Piers told Rawson the threat was serious enough to bring in more of the Airborne Brigade. And Rawson agreed. On the 5th, he set the move up. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 503rd, most of the brigade's artillery and the brigade headquarters, all of it out of Phu Yen Province and up to Dak To. The 3rd Battalion stayed where it was. It had only just arrived in Vietnam, and it was left down in Phu Yen to cover the rice harvest. The brigade that came to Dak To came with 3 battalions rather than 4, and worked the battle that way. Rawson also gave it a standing allotment of B-52 strikes, and before long the high bombers were working the country south and west of the airfield. On the 7th, Brigadier General Leo Schweiter brought the headquarters of the 173rd forward to Ben Het and put himself under Piers. He had landed in Normandy and had been at Bastogne, had fought in Korea afterwards, had commanded a special forces group, and had taken the brigade over that August. The division of work was settled the same day. Lieutenant Colonel David Schumacher's battalion took the security of Ben Het, and James Staverson's took over the defense of the two airfields at Dak To. That freed Colonel Richard Johnson's brigade for Rocket Ridge and Nok Dorlang, and it left Schweiter one battalion of his own. James Johnson's 4th of the 503rd, for the Dak Klong Valley running south from the camp. What the airfield could not do, it wrote down afterwards. There was no proper arrival airfield control group at Dak To. No standing organization whose business was to meet a unit as it came in, empty its aircraft and clear its people off the strip. And the brigade recorded in its own report that reception and unloading went less well than they should have. The last of the reinforcement was ordered on the 12th. Rawson told Colonel Donald Rattan to move 2 airmobile battalions of the 1st Cavalry Division and their batteries in from Bin Din. The 2nd of the 8th Cavalry went to Kontum and was held ready there. The 1st of the 12th went into the lower Dak Hodrai Valley, southeast of the paratroopers, sitting across the way out toward Cambodia. By the 3rd week, Piers had a little over 16,000 men under his hand, his own division, a brigade of the Cavalry Division, 3 battalions of paratroopers, and 6 battalions of the South Vietnamese Army. Nearly all of them had arrived inside a fortnight. For most of them, the walking had not started yet. The new airfield was called Dak To 2, and it lay about 5 kilometers from the village, with a hard-surfaced runway 4,200 feet long. Mountains stood round it on all 4 sides. Along its northern edge were the Brigade Support Center and the forward supply point, and past those the ground began to climb. Everything that ended up on the high ground came through here first. Every round fired off a hilltop. Every case of rations carried up a spur. Every man who walked into the trees south of the road had been set down on this strip and had walked off it. The fighting was on the ridges. The fighting was supplied from one flat rectangle at the bottom of a valley. The mountains that closed the valley in also closed off its radios. Very high-frequency traffic could hardly get out of the field at all, and it was turned instead through the tower at the Special Forces camp 4 kilometers to the east, which stood higher than everything else and had a gap in the hills to the south to talk through. The aircraft of this battle was the C-130. 308 of them came into Dak To in the course of November, most of them on a fixed schedule of 20 sorties a day that the staff had arranged with 1st Field Force. The schedule was the whole point. With a standing 20 a day, the running scramble for emergency deliveries very largely stopped. Convoys brought in 600 tons a day. The air brought in 300 more. Fuel, ammunition, and peneprime came straight through from the port at Quy Nhon, without being broken down anywhere on the way, and some of it went on past the field to the helipads and the forward fire bases. Handling on the ground was quick when the equipment was there, 5 to 10 minutes to strip an aircraft. Crews pulled the loads off the pallets and put them onto tractor trailers, and the trailers went either to the temporary dump beside the field or straight out to the gun positions. Fuel was drained out of the aircraft's own tanks and kept. The runway itself was thin. It had a single-layer treatment on it and nothing more, and where the C-130s rolled most it wore through, all the way through. Company D of the 4th Engineer Battalion kept it flyable, with a cold mix of RC3 and crushed stone 3/4 of an inch and smaller, shoveled into the worn places and rolled flat. Over the period, they patched 445 square yards of it. That work was done at night. In the day, the strip had aircraft standing on it and aircraft coming in, and there was no hour in which to close it, so the patching was done in the dark, and on some nights the situation outside would not allow lights to be put on, and then it was done in pieces, a stretch at a time, whenever there was a stretch to be had. Dust was the other standing job. In the first week of November, Company D laid 16,000 gallons of penepreme and cut back RC3 over everything that lifted, the shoulders, the parking areas, the ground beside the dump, and then handed the equipment and the task on to Company A and went back to the runway. Water went short as soon as the paratroopers arrived. The water point at Dak To 2 had been sized for what was there before them, and with the brigade in, the drinking water was just sufficient and the rest was not. Not enough to hold the dust down, and not enough for men to wash. It was settled in 2 days, with a pump good for 1,500 gallons an hour brought up, and the brigade's own pump set to work at the Dak To 1 complex. The road was the other half of it. Route 512 was unimproved, a dry weather road with bypasses cut round the bad places for heavy vehicles, and the staff wrote plainly in its report that the whole of it would have to be rebuilt to an all-weather standard before the next monsoon, and that this would be a large piece of engineering. The clearing was done with Rome plows, heavy dozers carrying a cutting blade instead of an ordinary one, which take the forest off in a swath. From the 25th of October to the 22nd of November, a section of them worked 100 meters deep along both sides of Route 512 and over the ground at Ben Het, 690 acres. A second pair of sections did the same along Highway 14, from Kontum up to Dak To, and by the end of the month the clearing of both roads was done. Company D swept 512 for mines every morning between the 2 bridges. On the 12th of November, one of those bridges went down. An armored launched bridge was across the gap before 9 that morning. A pipe culvert went in under the roadway after it, and traffic was moving again the next afternoon. By the 13th, the road and the air together had brought the stocks up to the 3-day level that had been wanted from the start. Out at Ben Het, the engineers were building a field of their own, laid out for the small C-7A, but graded from the beginning so that it could be widened for C-130S in a hurry, and clearing the ground beside it for a camp that was to be moved out there. The field at Kontum, back down Highway 14, carried what Dak To could not. In the last week of November, Company B built a U-shaped turnaround for C-130s on its northeastern side so that aircraft could get themselves off the parking apron. Fill hauled in and graded, the surface soaked with peneprime, and steel planking laid over the loop where the wheels would run. The staff set the whole thing down in its report afterwards. Add the hundreds of helicopter landings and takeoffs every day to those C-130 sorties, and Dak To 2 in this period was one of the busiest airfields in Vietnam. It had one runway with a single thin coat on it and a wall of high ground at either end. Behind the field, the engineers built what shelter they could out of what was lying about. The revetments for the light aircraft of the air controllers were made of empty 55-gallon drums, stacked 2 rows high with the bottom row 2 drums wide, filled with earth and sandbagged along the top, 8 feet of wall in all. The tightest the field ever came was at the end of the month, on the 25th and the 26th, with a brigade moving out of the area. Helicopters were putting down on the Dak To 2 fuel point. C-130s were loading a little way off, and the helicopters of an assault lift were refueling in between the two. It was untangled by sending the helicopters across to the Airborne Brigade's own fuel point. After that, a third of the old strip at Dak To 1 was soaked with pentaprime and given over to them, and a 5,000-gallon tanker of JP4 was rolled out onto it in the morning and stood there through the day, and the helicopters came into it in their turn. The 1st Artillery of the battle came into the valley on the 28th of October, with the 1st Brigade of the 4th Division, the 6th Battalion of the 29th Artillery, 105mm howitzers on their trailers. One battery was already standing in the district, left there with the mechanized troops it had been firing for. When that battalion was taken out of the valley, the battery stayed where it was and added its tubes to the two that had just arrived. Where a gun could stand was decided by the ground, and the ground here allowed almost nothing. There were no roads into the ridges and no trails a prime mover could take. Infantry working the high country moved beyond the reach of medium artillery within a day, and got only the light howitzers that could be flown to them. So a firing position went where the infantry was going, which was up, and a howitzer built to be towed along a road had nowhere to stand except the top of a hill. The rest came in through the first days of November, one battery at a time. On the 30th of October, a battery of self-propelled 155mm howitzers closed into Dak To. On the 2nd of November, the paratroopers got the first battery of their own artillery, towed 105s, a few hours behind the infantry it belonged to. By the second week, the mixture was complete in kind. Towed and self-propelled 155s had come in on the 5th, along with a platoon of 175mm guns, and more of both arrived on the 9th. On the 10th, a platoon of 8-inch howitzers closed into Dak To, and the building up of the general support artillery was finished. That much artillery in one small district had to be run from somewhere. On the 9th of November, a tactical command post of the division artillery opened at Dak To to hold all of it in one hand. Air was handled alongside it, hour by hour. Over the length of the operation, 2,096 sorties of tactical aircraft were worked in among the batteries. By the middle of November, the count stood at 15 batteries and 77 guns of all calibers. It was the largest concentration of artillery the district would hold. Getting the medium howitzers onto the hills was done by helicopter. The 155mm howitzers went into the fire bases slung under CH-54s, the flying cranes, which had first lifted a gun of that weight a year and a half before. On the 13th of November, a battery of towed 155s was flown onto a forward fire base south of the airfield. It stayed there to the end of the operation, and from that one position it fired for all 3 brigades that came into the district whenever they were inside its range. Before the gun, there had to be a place for the gun. The ground on a summit is not flat, and a battery needs level pads, a fire direction center, pits for ammunition, somewhere for helicopters to sit down. The battalion maintenance section took 2 D6B bulldozers and rebuilt them so that each came apart into 2 loads, tracks, frame and blade in one, engine and body in the other, and in that condition the cranes carried them up. On the 13th of November, one of them went from the old airstrip at Dak To onto the fire base of the 1st Battalion of the 8th Infantry. It leveled the pads for the 155 battery and the fire direction center, dug the holes for the operation center and the ammunition store, flattened 2 helicopter pads. Then it turned outward and cut the fields of fire, an opening in the trees about 200 meters by 500. The second dozer went up on the 23rd, onto a hill in the southwest, for the 3rd Battalion of the 12th Infantry. The trees there stood about 150 feet high with trunks 18 to 24 inches through, and no blade would push them over. They were brought down with demolition charges and dragged aside, and the clearing left behind was 150 meters by 600. Ammunition went up the same way, slung under the CH-47s, and it went up constantly. Once the brigade command post had moved to Dak To, they worked out an arrangement to save a step. Ammunition arriving by road convoy went from the supply point straight onto the battery that needed it, still loaded on the trucks and trailers it had come in on. It removed one handling of the heavy 105 rounds, and one handling was worth removing. The worst supply failure of the operation was of that kind. On the 17th of November, 900 rounds of 105 millimeter ammunition arrived at the Dak To fire base from Kontum without fuses, and there were 200 fused rounds on hand. Fuses were shuttled in by UH-1D through the night and on into the following morning, one small load after another, until the gun line had something it could fire. Small things ran short and were borrowed back and forth. The slings the South Vietnamese had for lifting 105 pieces, and their ammunition were unserviceable, and they took slings from the Airborne brigade, which was short of them too. American batteries put liaison officers into the fire direction centers of 3 Vietnamese batteries, so that the 2 artilleries could work the same ground. On the 17th, a self-propelled battery was moved northeast to Old Dak to add its weight to the South Vietnamese guns firing in that direction. 2 days later, there was a large fight up there, and the battery was already sitting where it needed to be. Batteries moved like that all through the battle. 48 times the guns came out of their pits, went where the fighting had gone, and were laid in again. When a target had been located and there was time to prepare, as many as 6 batteries were brought onto it at once, every round timed to arrive together. In support of a large fight, 6 to 8 would be working the ground around it. The volume that came out of this is one of the few numbers the reports state plainly. Over the battle, the 77 guns fired more than 151,000 rounds of all calibers. General Pears, writing afterwards, put the reason without decoration. There were a great many of the enemy in the district, and a great many of the contacts came against carefully built positions. And against that the answer was to use tactical air and artillery to the limit of what could be brought. The fire bases were shot at in their turn. On the evening of the 17th of November, rockets came down on the fire base of the 1st of the 8th Infantry, where the 155 battery stood. The position they were fired from could be seen from the Cavalry Division command post, and the aerial rocket artillery was onto it within minutes. Counter-battery radars were working at Dak To and Ben Het, at Kontum and Pole Kleng, and they worked well. What the guns were firing at they could not see. The double canopy closed over the ridges and left air observation for the artillery badly limited, and much of the fire went out to a square on a map and a voice on a radio. On the hilltops, the tubes stood on leveled ground inside the openings that had been cut for them, and where the cutting stopped, the forest began again. On the 3rd of November, 2 companies of the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Infantry lifted out of Ben Het and came down on the top of Hill 882, the highest point of the Ngoc Dorlong Mass. They took the summit with small loss. In the evening there was single shooting out of the trees below them, and then it stopped, and both companies stayed the night up there. This was the shape of the whole month, set down on the first hill. A battalion works its way along a ridge or is put on the crest by helicopter. There are prepared positions somewhere on the slope or on the top. There is a fight of a few hours or of a day. Then the crest belongs to the Americans, and the next ridge west is the next piece of work. Colonel Belknap's route ran west along the Nok Dorlang, 882 first, then 843, then 724 at the far end. On the morning of the fourth, one of his companies fought northeast of the summit for a little over 2 hours. On the fifth, they tried to get across the ravine to 843. The ravine was very steep. The resistance on the far side was heavy, and they came back up onto 882 for the night. They took 843 the following day, 7 kilometers south of Ben Het, at the mouth of the Dak Klong Valley. There was a hill marked 823. General Schweiter and James Johnson, who commanded the 4th of the 503rd, had flown over that country together and chosen it. It dominated the ground around. It sat over the junction of 2 trails, and it was just inside the range of the guns at Ben Het. 3 companies would walk to it, and a 4th would be flown onto the crest to build a fire base. The 3 companies started at 8:45 on the 6th of November, on parallel routes, working the ground between Ben Het and the hill. For the men doing the walking, this was the 4th day out. Their battalion commander followed them from a helicopter. The crest would not open. Airstrike after airstrike went in from 8:15, and there was still no place for a single helicopter to sit down. The landing time came and went. More strikes were called for and put in, and only then was the growth torn apart enough for the ships to come in one at a time and hover a few feet up while men dropped into a tangle of split bamboo. A little before noon, on an intermediate height called Nok Kom Leet, one of the walking companies stopped. A soldier had seen a communication wire running up the slope. They were told to follow it, and at 1 o'clock they took automatic fire from the high ground above them and stayed in it for the rest of the afternoon. The company on the crest of 823 touched down about 2:30. Captain Baldridge walked his men over the top of it. There were between 50 and 100 fighting holes cut along the ridge. There were packs left behind and rifle stocks freshly smashed. Whoever had cut those holes had been gone some hours. Half an hour later, the enemy came up the slope at them on a broad front, and the fight for the hill ran the whole night. An AC-47 turned overhead and put down flares every 15 minutes until dawn. The 1 mortar crew on the hill worked from the bottom of a large crater with the tube standing almost vertical, dropping rounds 100 meters outside their own perimeter. The firing thinned and stopped a little before dawn on the 7th. At first light, the company counted 16 dead. Papers taken on the hill pointed to the 66th Regiment and told the Americans that regular divisional troops were in the Dak Klong Valley. On the 9th, another battalion took the place over, and the paratroopers who had held it came off for a rest. South of the airfield, on the Rocket Ridge, the 3rd Battalion of the 12th Infantry was working north along the same pattern. On the 9th of November, Colonel Vollmer's men found a bunker complex on the lower slopes of Hill 1338. Vollmer had in mind what a fight 3 days earlier had cost, and he did not go at it. He waited several hours while air and artillery worked the position over. The next day they took it and then took a second line of bunkers higher up the slope, and it cost them 7 men. Behind the second line was an abandoned mortar pit, dug large enough for a 120-millimeter tube, a weapon with the range to reach the bases at Dak To from where it stood. The 11th of November was a day in 3 places. 2 kilometers west of the fire base on 823 stands the Nok Kring Ridge, and the ridge has 2 summits. The southern one is marked 889. The northern one carries no marking at all in the reports. Colonel Schumacher's battalion split to take both. The force sent against the southern summit came under fire from bunkers hidden above them on the slope, pulled back off it, and waited while air and artillery came down. Several hours later, the line of bunkers was theirs, and above it, further up the slope, there was a second complex to do over again. On the northern summit, it went differently. The force that went up there was surrounded and held where it was. A company was flown out from Dak To to reach them, came down on the open saddle between the 2 summits, and fought its way up the northern slope. By the staff studies count, 21 paratroopers were killed that day, and 154 wounded, and the task force built out of 2 companies was rated unfit for further fighting. The same study sets out the method without heat. Hold the attacking troops with fire from the bunkers in front of them, and then put another unit into their rear or their flank. Away to the east on the Nok Dorlong, Belknap's men went up Hill 724 that same morning. The last hill on their line, the one they had been fighting toward since the 8th, and the one air and artillery had worked for 2 days. 3 companies climbed it and met nothing. On the top there were craters and broken trees. The crest was empty, exactly as every crest before it had been empty. It meant nothing. The enemy was not on the hill. The enemy was below it on the northern and western slopes, and came out of the forest after the last group had reached the top. The fight went on for 8 hours. The hill was held at the end of it. Hill 1338 was still not finished. The battalion came back to it in the middle of the month, and on the 16th, a patrol walked into trenches and bunkers on the approach and pulled back to call fire onto them. They had expected the crest by that evening. They stopped 700 or 800 meters short of it, made another 600 under fire, then gave back about 200 meters along the ridge and went down for the night. On the 17th, 2 companies attacked and were in contact the whole day, and the top was secure at 5:15. 9 men were killed taking it and 32 wounded. They had come up through 6 lines of trenches, studded with bunkers and open firing positions, the most developed positions any unit of the division's 1st Brigade met in the whole campaign. After that, the ridges south of the airfield went quiet. On the 19th, the company attacked the neighboring height, 1294, found a prepared perimeter waiting on it, and stepped back to call in air and artillery. The following day it walked onto the hill and found the perimeter unoccupied. From the 20th to the 23rd, the company searched out from 1,338 and from 1,294 over the same slopes and the same trenches, and made no contact at all. A rifle company of the 503rd Infantry went out from Dak To on the 6th of November with 85 enlisted men and 4 officers. One of the 4 was a forward observer from an artillery battery, walking with the company as part of it. Every man carried rations for 2 days. Every man carried a full pack, and a full pack came to 50 pounds. Each rifleman went out with 500 rounds for his rifle. and on top of that, 200 rounds for the machine guns, which came to something over 1,400 rounds of carried ammunition across the company. At the end of every magazine, the last round loaded was a tracer. A man firing in the dark would see it go and know that he was nearly empty. The company had 6 machine guns, 1 to a squad, and it split into 2 platoons for the march. Grenadiers carried 50 high explosive rounds and 50 of buckshot, with the adapters for them. Each man had 4 fragmentation grenades and 2 smoke, and there were mines by the squad. No mortars went out that day, and no recoilless rifles. Another company, going out on the 13th, was loaded a little differently. 400 rounds and more to the riflemen, 1,200 rounds and more for each machine gun, 12 mines to the platoon, a trip flare apiece. Smoke could be any color a man happened to have, except red. Red marked the enemy's position, and a red grenade thrown by mistake would be answered. Later in the month, a battalion tried going light. Each man took 1 meal and 1 canteen, on the understanding that there would be streams along the route. Every platoon carried 20 rounds for the 60mm mortar, and the weapons platoon carried 70 rounds in 2 tubes. The heavier weapons would come up by helicopter afterward. Water was the hard part. Natural sources in the area of operations were scarce, and as in many operations in Vietnam, water had to be brought to the troops by helicopter. It arrived in whatever the aircraft could carry, and once it was on the ground, it had to be moved by the men themselves. There were 3 ways of carrying it, and none of them was good. The 5-gallon can was standard, and when the water in it was gone, a unit either waited for a helicopter to lift the empties out or destroyed them, because for a rifleman in the mountains, an empty can was too bulky and too heavy to keep. Plastic containers folded down flat when empty and were far easier to move, but the jungle tore them open. The 3rd way had been worked out in another division altogether, and it was to wash out the fired cases from a 155mm howitzer and fill those. On the ridges there was nothing to fill anything from. When a company came down off a spur to a stream, it filled the canteens of the men who had stayed on top, and then it carried them back up. Talking was the other hard part. The high-frequency circuit sagged in that terrain, because 2 relays had to be strung one behind the other to make them work at all. Voice communication with the division base camp held up only through the relay station on Dragon Mountain, and between the brigade's fire bases, the signal was thrown over intervening ridges deliberately, so that where an antenna stood and how high it stood decided everything. The band itself was crowded. In the first days of November, the fight went from 2 battalions and 1 brigade to a division and more, and every frequency allotted to the division was in use somewhere in the Dak To area, some of them more than once. Stations talked over each other as a matter of course. A clean frequency was the exception. Forward elements walked out of range of the portable sets, and sometimes out of range of the vehicle sets as well, so that requests for supply came in late, and now and then came in twice. The heavy radio relay equipment was moved by air 4 times during the campaign, because there was no road to the places it was needed. All of it was carried up through ground that gave nothing away. A column moved at the speed of whoever was cutting at the front of it, and the man cutting was changed often, because nobody lasted long at it. What the lead man could see was what the second man would be walking through in a minute, and no more than that. So the column ahead of a rifleman was mostly a sound, brush going down, and boots, and somebody's canteen. Getting anything at all onto a slope depended on ground that did not exist. The forest there was hard timber that resisted the axe and resisted demolition, and cutting a pad for a single helicopter was an enormous piece of work. Planners came out of the campaign saying that a landing zone in that jungle needed 1 to 2 days of air and artillery beforehand, and that several should always be prepared at once, so that the enemy could not tell which one would be used. The one thing that held up supply by air to the units on the hillsides was a shortage of tools for making pads. Where a company had nothing to cut with, its resupply waited until it had cut a hole in the canopy anyway. Units came and went underneath all this. On the 5th of November, 2 battalions of the Airborne Brigade, most of its artillery and its headquarters, flew in from the coast. Around the 10th, a battalion of the 8th Infantry came up from Darlak Province, and its rear element sat in Kontum for 4 days and supplied it from there, since the battalion was working far enough south that the difference in flying time hardly showed. Companies stopped where the day left them, sometimes 2 together, sometimes each on its own. Listening posts went out in pairs a little way down the slope. Everyone else dug and cut back the undergrowth to open some field of fire in ground that was often craters and broken stumps, left by the bombing that had gone in ahead of them. Nights on the crests were the part nobody had been warned about. The afternoons up there were hot enough to work a man dry, and after dark, the same ridge took the heat back out of him, and what a company had to put against that was whatever it had carried up its own slope. Men sat in whatever they had managed to dig, in ground that was mostly root and stone, and waited out the hours until there was enough light to see the next stretch of ridge. Then the packs went back on. 50 pounds, 2 days of rations, 500 rounds and a tracer at the end of each magazine, and the ridge ahead was the same shape as the ridge behind. In the night of the 11th and 12th of November, mortar rounds came down on the airfield complex at Dak To. Other shelling had reached the base before, 6 or 10 rounds at a time falling well outside the perimeter. This was the first that came onto the airfield itself, and it went on long enough to be counted. 44 rounds were received. When the counting was finished in the morning, the damage amounted to 2 men wounded and 3 vehicles with minor damage. Nothing on the field had been lost. The aircraft came in that day as they had come in the day before. Everything the field did, it did in daylight. Dak To could not be used for supply after dark, which put every landing, every unloading, and every departure into the same working hours, day after day, in the same place on the same strip. Air crews on the ground worked to get off it again quickly, and the ground crews worked to turn them around. And that was the shape of the working day. The rest of that day went the way the days had been going. A battalion of the 503rd Infantry was lifted onto an old landing site to the west and began putting in a new fire base. A battalion of the 8th Infantry went into a position south of the road to set up a battery of medium howitzers. The bridge on the highway was down, and a bridge layer was standing in the gap. On the 14th, the fuel point for aviation gasoline was moved outside the perimeter of the Airborne Brigade's camp. The camp was crowded, and there were few men to guard the new spot, so it was sited where the guns could see it and cover it with direct fire. That was the sort of problem the field presented in the middle of the month. The same day, 2 companies were lifted onto high ground east of the base. Intelligence expected a rocket attack from that hill and wanted the ground looked at. There was no contact. What the companies found were positions freshly dug and freshly prepared, and they came back with that. On the morning of the 15th, at 8:45, the base was taken under fire again. This time the fire came from 82mm mortars and from 75mm recoilless rifles, and it did not stop after a burst. It came in and slackened and came in again, on and off through the whole of the daylight and into the end of the afternoon. Piers was in the air over the base in his own helicopter when it started. Afterward, the craters were counted and gave 55 rounds. The report that recorded the number said plainly that more than that had probably been fired. The firing positions were located by counter-mortar radar and by the forward air controllers overhead, mostly in the low hills to the south of the base. The target had been obvious from the first round. Transports had come into Dak To that morning and were standing on the parking ramp unloading, which was where they stood at that hour of any day that month. The opening round went across the strip and long, something over 100 meters past everything, into an empty helicopter revetment. The next one hit a transport, and within 5 minutes of the first explosion, the aircraft was burning. A third round fell into the ammunition supply point and made a small explosion there. A fourth hit a second aircraft, boxed in behind the first, some 25 minutes after the first one caught fire. 2 of the transports burned where they stood, and they burned until late in the evening. Another took splinters through a wing tank and began losing fuel heavily. Its crew got it away from the fire under its own power, and it was pulled clear afterward and flew out later. Counter-battery fire brought the volume down within 20 minutes of the first explosion. The rest of the day went into repeated attempts on one recoilless rifle position, all of them competently made and none of them successful. The mortar crew was in the Doxer Valley, in the ground between Rocket Ridge and the hills of Nok Dorlong, and by one account artillery and helicopter gunships were what finally quieted it. At 5:45 in the evening, the ammunition supply point took a direct hit. What went off first was ammunition that had come off one of the transports onto the ramp that morning and had not yet been moved into the dump. The garrison could not put the fire out. The explosion had broken the main water line at Dak To, and there was no pressure to fight with. Water and foam were expended from every piece of firefighting equipment on the field. By one account, the fire was nearly beaten, and then the water ran out, and while the tanker went away to refill, it got up again and went beyond anybody. Fuel running out of the burning aircraft reached a place where tar was stored in drums. The tar melted and caught and ran, and it ran into the ammunition point. Going out onto the ramp on anything but a tank was not considered survivable by then. Pieces of exploded artillery rounds a foot long and a hand's width across were coming down all over the area. The leaking transport was moved with a chain hooked to its nose gear, and a tank on the other end of the chain. Around 9:30 that night came the largest explosion of all. A sentry standing in a command post about 1 kilometer away was knocked off his feet. A man sitting indoors was thrown out of his chair and against the wall. A second heavy explosion came around 11:30, weaker than the first, and it was a container of demolition explosive going off. After that, the fire settled and began to go down. Because the ammunition in it had burned and the rest of the property in the area had burned with it, by the division's count, more than 800 tons of ammunition were destroyed in the course of the night. Refrigerator vans in the ration yard were put out of service. Materials handling equipment was destroyed or damaged, and the headquarters of the forward support area was extensively damaged. Fuel bladders on the ramp were punctured by splinters. They did not catch, but the fuel in them was contaminated. Morning showed the rest of it. Unexploded ammunition lay across half the base, and the strip was cratered and covered with torn metal that cut tires. Demolition men were wanted urgently, and not only for the runway, the forward support area, the camp beside the field, and the engineer company area. All had sensitive and unexploded ammunition lying in them. The staff, writing later, did not put the day down to luck. For several days running, 2 and 3 transports had been unloading on that ramp at the same time, and a round placed well on the leading aircraft closed the way off it for everything behind. It was a schedule, and it had been watched. On the 16th, the fire was brought under control. The demolition teams went over the strip through the day, and the field stayed shut. 10 kilometers northeast of Ton Con, a hill stands over the country, and the maps gave it as 1416. South Vietnamese troops had been climbing it since the middle of November. The 3rd Battalion of the 42nd Infantry came up against a line of works on the way to the top and stopped there. And the men holding the works belonged to the 24th Regiment. On the 15th, the Corps commander, General Vin Locke, put in 2 airborne battalions from the Joint Reserve, and a 3rd, worn down in earlier fighting, went south to Saigon. Breaking the line took 4 days of fighting uphill. The summit was taken. The 24th Regiment broke contact and went off the hill, and it was not found there again. The same thing was going on across the valley. On Rocket Ridge and on Nok Dorlang, the contacts had stopped, and between the 15th and the 20th, the 2 infantry battalions searching those sectors walked through what had been left in them. Bunker systems, trench lines, base camps with nobody in them. The works had been dug well before any of this, by men who had had months to do it. Whoever had held them had gone west while the fighting was somewhere else. General Pears read it as a withdrawal. The sign said that the 32nd and the 66th had started back toward the border, and that if the regiments were going to be caught on the way out, the catching would have to be quick. For some days he had been asking himself whether the 2 of them had come to the end of what they could take. The southern routes were closed off by his own 2nd Brigade and by the brigade from the 1st Cavalry. For the western ones, he was counting on the Airborne Brigade. What that made was not a closed cordon, and the report says so plainly. There was too much ground for it. The blocking units had a chance of taking something more out of the regiments as they went. The airfield at Dak To was working again from the 17th, with 1 C-13, on the ground at a time. Trucks came up Highway 14 from Pleiku and turned west. On the 18th, 204 of them came into Dak To, carrying 1,052 tons. The load came off at the western end of the strip, where the ramp was still being repaired, and a crew there could empty an aircraft in 5 minutes. From the 18th, the supply people worked at what they called the second buildup. Every unit was in contact, which meant covering the day's consumption and rebuilding the stocks behind it at the same time. Convoys out of Pleiku carried loads for 2 destinations, and the drivers ran cards of different colors to tell them apart. The airlift planned for the 18th was turned into Kontum instead, to shorten the truck turnaround. By the end of the day, the field there was stacked with cargo and short of the machines to lift it, and on the 19th it came back to Dak To. On the 18th, Schweiter started the brigade moving again, up the last stretch of the Dak Klong Valley. Schumacher's 1st Battalion of the 503rd was to search a hill 2 kilometers west of Fire Base 16. The 2nd Battalion was to go over another one. 2 kilometers south of that, and the maps gave the southern hill as 875. Schumacher took A, C, and D companies up the northern hill in the afternoon. His men were still getting their wind at the top when an observer saw a squad coming up from the west. They got down behind fallen trunks and opened fire, and the weight of the answer grew as more came in from that side, and mortar crews joined it from below. Schumacher called for air and artillery. The strikes and the shelling put the mortars down and took the pressure off the perimeter, and the fighting died away over the next few hours. 6 of Schumacher's men were killed and 29 wounded. The following morning, the companies went back over the ground and brought in the weapons lying on it. What had come at them out of the west was the 3rd Battalion of the 174th Regiment. The other hill stood 2 kilometers to the south, deep in the highlands, 8 kilometers from the Cambodian border. It was another ridge in a month of ridges, and there was nothing on the map to say otherwise. Its eastern and western slopes fell away steeply enough to be written down as impassable, which left the northern side to walk up and the southern side behind it. The battalion went south with 3 rifle companies and a company of Montagnard irregulars, the 23rd Mobile Strike Force under Steverson, who commanded the 2nd of the 503rd. Coming up on the hill at 10:45, the irregulars turned off to work round it and look at the southern side. On the climb, they were fired on heavily from what appeared to be a line of well-hidden bunkers. They pulled back for a few hours and let the aircraft and the guns work, then went up a second time and got the same result. The company set a perimeter at the foot of the hill and waited. At 2 in the afternoon, the senior of the company commanders, Captain Harold Kaufman, was given the job over the radio to plan the attack and to take the battalion up. He sat down on the ground beside his radio operator and got the map out of his thigh pocket. The hill on it carried no name at all, only a figure in meters for its height. He called it Hill 875. A battalion of that kind was supposed, by the staff studies reckoning, to field 4 companies and something near 600 men. Kaufman planned the attack with 3 companies and a little under 290. A company was down to 81 men in the field, and B Company, which had taken the worst of the fighting behind them, was not counted fit to go up at all. Steverson ran the operation from a command helicopter. The changed orders went into a damp notebook at 2:20 in the afternoon, and half an hour after that the company started to move. The leading company took 2 hours to come round to the northern foot of the hill. On the way, it walked into a small hospital complex, empty, and went through it. Each rifleman was carrying 18 or 20 magazines for his rifle, and most of them had boxes of loose ammunition in the pack as well. The battalion laid out a camp at the foot and the last of the light and put ambushes out on the tracks. The guns worked on the crest through the night. A forward observer from the 319th Artillery had been calling fire onto it since the evening, and aircraft came in on it in the dark between the chutes. The rounds fired in support of that attack over the 18th and the 19th of November were counted afterward at 7,886. At the foot of the hill, nobody slept much. The morning of the 19th began with waiting. Kaufman held the start of the attack while a forward air controller brought in a last pair of F-100s over the crest, and the company stood at the foot of the hill with their packs on and went over their weapons again. Overhead, the canopy had been opened by the night's work, and daylight was coming through it onto the floor of the forest. They went up the northern side in the middle of the morning. C Company on the right, D Company on the left, A Company following in reserve. The ground was slow. Bamboo and scrub stood thick on the slope, and the trees brought down by the shelling and the bombing lay across the line of the climb, so that a man went over them rather than round. At 10:30, the leading company was fired on. The companies pulled back a little way and called for air and artillery, and about half an hour later they went on up. Above them they came into the first line of bunkers and trenches and worked through it. The staff study set it down afterward as 3 lines of bunkers dug into the slope, each able to cover the others, joined by deep tunnels with trenches along the crest above. Many of the bunkers had a horseshoe trench cut behind them, so that the men in them could go back out under cover. On the steep western side there were wooden steps led into the slope. The attack came to a stop about midday. Steverson took the companies back a few hundred meters down the hill, so that the fighter bombers and the guns could work the ground in front of them. And 2 hours later it started again. At about 2 in the afternoon, a company was given the job of opening a landing zone for the wounded. A helicopter came over and dropped axes and chainsaws to them. At 2:30, by the brigade's account, 2 companies of North Vietnamese came in on the rear and the flanks of A Company and pushed it up the slope into the ground, held by C and D. Those 2 turned round from their own front and helped to beat the attack off. 5 minutes after that, Kaufman reported to battalion that his 3 companies were surrounded. By about 3:30, the companies had closed on one another and made a perimeter roughly 100 meters across. It sat where the back of the ridge flattened out and then fell away on either side. C Company held from 12 o'clock round to 5. D Company from 7 round to 12, and A Company was fitted in between them from 4 to 10. The command post stood in the middle. Cover on that ground was stumps and fallen trunks. The holes were shallow, scraped out with helmets and with knives. A rifleman had come up the hill carrying 18 or 20 magazines. By the middle of the afternoon, a good many of them were down to a few. Resupply went in from above, in the gaps between the airstrikes. Helicopters of the 335th came over the perimeter through the afternoon, and the fire from the ground drove them off again and again. Between 1 o'clock and 4, 4 of their Hueys were brought down near the battalion's position. Some of what they dropped fell outside the perimeter and stayed there. What got in was enough. At 25 to 6, one machine got 2 pallets of ammunition into the perimeter from 80 feet up. The guns of the 319th Artillery held a ring of fire round the position for the rest of the day. A-1s and F-100s worked the crest above, one after another. At about 7 in the evening, a bomb from a supporting aircraft fell into the middle of the American position, on the ground where the command post stood. 42 men were killed and 45 wounded. Among the dead were the officer commanding in the perimeter, Captain Harold Kaufman, and the chaplain of the 2nd of the 503rd, Major Charles Waters. The contact broke off at 7:10. First Lieutenant Bartholomew O'Leary, who had brought D Company up the hill, took over the battalion. He reported to brigade that there were 3 officers left on their feet with him, and that the perimeter would hold until morning if nothing came added in strength. Nothing came added in strength. That evening, Schweiter went to Piers and got permission to move 3 companies of the 4th of the 503rd onto Fire Base 16. A flight of Chinooks put B Company in before dark. A company and C Company came in the following morning with James Johnson, who commanded the 4th of the 503rd. From first light on the 20th, O'Leary's men worked on the landing zone. They felled trees and cut the scrub with the axes and saws dropped to them the day before. And they worked at it all day. What came out of a full day of that was a pad that would take one helicopter. A short mortaring came onto the position during the morning. The battalion was at the end of its ammunition by then. It had no medical supplies left and it needed water, and water was the first line on the request that went out. On the high ground, the temperature had gone down to about 10 degrees in the night, and most of the men on the hill had a poncho and a poncho liner and nothing else. The first helicopters that tried for the new pad were turned away by fire. One after another. At 4 in the afternoon, one of them got down. It brought in medical supplies and some officers of B Company of the 2nd of the 503rd, and it took 5 badly wounded men out when it went. That was the only machine that landed on the hill in 24 hours. B Company of the 4th of the 503rd came off Fire Base 16 on foot that morning and worked its way south, going round the places where the ground suited an ambush. It came up to the perimeter from below at 5 in the afternoon. About midnight, Johnson arrived with A and C companies and took over the American force on the hill. He brought 2 81mm mortars up with him and a quantity of 66mm rocket launchers, which Schweiter had sent out from Dak To. Against the bunkers on that slope, the launchers turned out to be nearly useless. The firing slits were about 15 centimeters wide, and nothing counted except a round that went in through the slit. Nothing else the battalion had with it that day would put a bunker down. Between 6:45 and 9:15 on the morning of the 21st, 30 rounds of 120mm mortar came onto the 3 companies of the 4th of the 503rd. Through the morning, the wounded of the 2nd Battalion were flown off the hill. Artillery and aircraft worked the high ground above the perimeter for about 8 hours. Later in the day, Johnson attacked with his 3 companies in line, A on the left, B in the center, C on the right. The bunkers stayed where they were. With the light going, he took the companies back to the line they had started from, and in the evening he put it to Schweiter that the force might be pulled off the hill altogether so that the B-52s could work the crest. Schweiter said no. The minimum safe distance for a strike of that kind was 3,000 meters, which meant going back as far as Fire Base 16, and he thought that in the time it took the enemy would be gone. He got the bombers in the end onto suspected assembly areas west and northwest of the hill. On the hill itself, the night came down cold again, and the guns went on working round the edges of the perimeter. On the morning of the 22nd of November, the mountain in the Dak To Valley was the same shape it had been all week. 875 meters, 8 kilometers from the Cambodian border, with its eastern and western faces falling away too steeply for a man to work up them. A line of bunkers laid across the north slope could not be gone around. Everything that had happened on the hill had happened on that one side of it. Piers gave the far side of the mountain to a battalion that had not been in any of it. The 1st Battalion of the 12th Infantry, under Harold Birch, had been flown up from Bon Mi Thuot and belonged to the 4th Division's 1st Brigade. It came to the hill from the south, over the reverse slope, on ground the fighting had not touched. The battalion had been working in Darlak Province until a few days before, on something that had nothing to do with this, and it came into the Dak To Valley on the same day it was given the mountain. None of its men had been on Hill 875 or anywhere near it. What the company saw first was the underside of the hill, from a helicopter, on the way down onto it. Companies A and D went in by helicopter at the foot of the south slope in the afternoon, and nothing was fired at them as they came down. Their instruction from Schweiter was to climb halfway and stop there. They worked up through the timber and set a blocking position for the night about midway along the slope. A few mortar rounds came in on them during the day, at intervals, and they saw no North Vietnamese at all. Above them on the other side of the crest, the 2 battalions of the 503rd stayed where the previous days had left them. Fire Base 16 stood 3 kilometers away over the ridges to the northwest, and the artillery had been working the crest for days. The arrangement by the evening of the 22nd was 3 battalions on one mountain, 2 of them below the crest on the north, and 1 below it on the south, none of them in contact with anybody. At first light on the 23rd, Schweiter sent the 2nd and the 4th of the 503rd up the north side, and the 1st of the 12th over the reverse slope. 3 battalions were moving on the same piece of ground from 2 directions at once, and there was no fire on the start line for either of them. The ground the paratroopers climbed had been worked over by artillery and by air until there was not much left of it. Craters, splintered stumps, timber lying across the slope in the direction it had been thrown, and holes in the canopy where light came down onto ground that had not had light on it. The battalions went up through it steadily. What fire met them was occasional, a few mortar rounds, some small arms. Nothing that stopped a company for long. They came up through the bunker line and it was open. The bunkers were roofed with heavy logs cut on the hill itself, with narrow slits at the front and trenches running behind them around the shoulder of the slope. Most of the work was still standing. None of it was being fought from. At about 11:30 in the morning, soldiers of the Airborne Brigade were standing on the top of Hill 875. Men coming up onto the crest called out Airborne and Geronimo. Below them on the far side, Companies A and D of the 1st of the 12th came up the opposite slope a little later and met almost nothing on the way. American reports had put the 1st and 2nd battalions of the 174th Regiment on this hill. On the morning of the 23rd, the regiment was not on it. The men who reached the top walked over the positions that had been holding them off the mountain. Nothing much was made of it at the time. The companies went across the ground, took stock of what was standing on it, and put security out along the ridgeline the way they would have done on any other night. The fight for Hill 875 ended because there was no longer anybody on Hill 875 to fight. When that had become true, none of the reports written afterwards were able to say. It was what had happened on most of the other hills that month, and it happened on this one last. There was little on the crest to take away from it. Bunkers and trenches, cut timber, the ground turned over and turned over again. The most heavily worked position in the whole campaign was in American hands by the middle of the morning. Through the middle of the day, the 3 battalions closed up onto the crest and onto the ground either side of it. Helicopters could put down on the top now, and did, and there was nothing left on the hill to stop them. The men who had come up the north slope were on the ridge line, and the men who had come over the reverse slope were on it beside them, and the 2 halves of the mountain had been joined by walking. In the afternoon, helicopters came in over the crest with hot food. It was Thanksgiving Day, and the meal had been ordered and flown up as it would have been anywhere else that the war allowed for it. Men ate it sitting on the top of the hill, on ground they had spent the better part of a week getting onto, in the middle of an afternoon in which nothing else happened. The paratroopers spent the night of the 23rd up there. Below them, the 1st of the 12th held the south slope. Listening post went out a little way down from the crest, as they had gone out on every other hill that month, and there was no contact from any direction during the hours of darkness. The mountain had been fought over since the 18th, and on the last night the Americans were on it, nothing came near them. On the morning of the 24th, Schweiter took them off. The 2nd and the 4th of the 503rd had been in the Dak To Valley for the best part of a week and were worn through, and they came out by helicopter from the crest they had reached the day before. The lift went off without anybody firing at it, and when it was finished there were no paratroopers left on the mountain at all. The Hill and Fire Base 16 both went to the 1st Battalion of the 12th Infantry. The fire base had been put in earlier in the month by one of the battalions that was now leaving, so the handover took in both the high ground and the position the guns had been firing from. The fresh battalion was left holding all of it, with its companies spread along the crest and down the south slope. What the brigade left behind on the mountain was a numbered height, an American battalion sitting on the top of it, and nothing else moving anywhere on the ground below. The Airborne Brigade spent the week after the 24th of November at Ben Het, putting itself back together. Its command post had been there since the beginning of the month, and now the rest of it came in as well. The 1st Brigade of the 4th Division stayed out in the hills. Through the last days of the month, its companies went on working the ridges and the valleys south of Route 512, over the same ground the fighting had been on. Companies of the 8th Infantry operated from Hill 1338 from the 25th of November to the 30th, and had no contact at all in that time. The Cavalry Brigade that had been brought into the area in the 2nd week of the month pulled out of the area on the 25th and the 26th. Northeast of Ton Con on the 29th, 2 South Vietnamese airborne battalions fought 2 battalions of the 24th Regiment. On the evening of the 1st of December, rockets and mortar rounds came down on Fire Base 12 at Ben Het. Nothing came after them. The battle that the division had been counting since the 25th of October ended there, at a fire base on the road west, with a shelling that nobody followed up. Then the reports were written. By the count in the division's after-action report, 290 Americans were killed between the 25th of October and the 1st of December. That is what the 4th Infantry Division put in writing for the period it called the Battle for Dak To. Of those, 194 were from the Airborne Brigade, which had come into the campaign on the 1st of November, with 3 battalions, and stayed in the mountains until it was over. For the whole fight on Hill 875, the brigade counted 107 dead. That was the cost of one height, set down on its own line. Apart from the rest of the ground the brigade had gone up that month, 2 men of the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd were awarded the Medal of Honor for the fighting on that hill, and both awards were posthumous. One was Charles Waters, the battalion's chaplain, a major. The other was Carlos Lozada, a specialist 4 and a machine gunner in Company A. Both names are also in the brigade's list of the dead for Hill 875. American reports at the end of the battle put the enemy's dead at 1,644. It was assembled from what the units in the field sent up over the same period, and it is an American count, kept by the side that was doing the counting. The reports came back to the forest more than to anything else. The canopy that hid the enemy hid the Americans too. Air crew and observers worked from above a roof of trees they could not see through, and hardwood a meter thick turned bombs and shells that had been laid on correctly, many of them fused to burst late, so that they would get down through the branches first. 77 guns had been brought into this one district over the course of the battle, and they fired more than 151,000 rounds. They arrived a few at a time through the first half of November, and the last of them was in position by the 16th. Almost all of the air that worked with them was Air Force. It is the only pair of figures in the reports that gives any sense of what the month had been like to sit through. On the other side of it, the division that had held these hills had been carrying its supplies across the border for better than a month before any of the fighting started, moving them up to staging areas well south of Dak To, and then, at the beginning of November, forward onto the positions themselves. What a man could carry on his back set the limit. Ammunition on that scale lasted a few days of heavy fighting, and there was no quick way to bring more of it up. The rocket and heavy mortar crews of the 40th Artillery Regiment never got onto Rocket Ridge at all. The 120mm tubes and the 122mm launchers that could have reached the airfield and the fire bases from that ground stayed off it for the whole of the battle. That, rather than anything done to them, is why the bases along the road were shelled as seldom as they were. Pierce set down his own assessment when it was over. The real defeat of the enemy, in his account, was not in the figures at all. He had been caught while he was still preparing an offensive of his own, one intended to show that he could take a piece of this country and hold on to it. Instead of that, he found himself on the defensive with no warning, and after 3 weeks and more of fighting, he went back to the places he had come from. The officer who took the division from Pierce at the beginning of January was of another mind about the hill. Charles Stone had not been in the Highlands during the battle and came to it cold, from the outside, some weeks after the last shot. He set no strategic value on the height whatever, and said so plainly in an interview the following year. Westmoreland put his own view of the campaign on paper in December. He had no quarrel with the tactical decisions his commanders had made, and he held that going after the enemy wherever he could be brought to a fight was worth doing, so long as it kept him up against the border. The argument for it was practical. A fight in the mountains was preferable to a fight down in the populated lowlands, where American firepower could not be used as freely, where the enemy could reach food, and where he would have far more room to move. An Air Force study of the second half of the year read the border fighting a third way. Dak To and Loc Ninh were tactical successes for the Allies in that account, and at the same time an advantage to the other side, because they turned Allied attention towards the border and away from the towns. At the close of the year, the Allied weight in the Highlands sat on the border. None of these accounts had much to say about what the sweeps were finding in the meantime. Storerooms, sleeping quarters, and command posts had been cut into the steep hillsides and lined from floor to ceiling with heavy timber, and in some of them food, equipment, and ammunition had been left where it lay. Camp after camp came up like that, whole and abandoned. Stragglers came in 1 and 2 at a time, and there were not many of them. The positions on Hill 875 turned out to have been finished only a few days before the brigade arrived at the foot of it. The 174th Regiment had built them out of the trees standing on the hill, and had been in them a matter of days. When the counting was finished, that was what was left up there. Cut timber and dug ground, standing where the regiment had put it. After the 1st of December, the units went back to the work they had been doing before. In the middle of the month, the headquarters of the Airborne Brigade and its 4th Battalion came out of the Highlands and returned to the coastal province they had left in the autumn. While they had been away, That whole area had been covered by a single battalion newly arrived from the United States, and for the entire month it had found very little. Over the next 2 months, the American Airborne unit settled back into the ordinary business of the coast, and the enemy divisions in the highlands rested and took in replacements. The ground around Dak To did not stay quiet for long, and it did not become anything other than what it had been. In February, the 1st Battalion of the 12th Infantry, which had fought around the city of Kontum through the winter, came back up to Dak To. By the beginning of March, the American strength in that part of the highlands was divided about evenly between 3 provinces, and the brigade responsible for Kontum was watching one enemy regiment somewhere north of the city, and 2 more, the 66th and the 174th, in the country around Dak To. They were the same 2 regiments that had held the hills in November. American intelligence read the spring the way it usually read a season, from what patrols saw and what the radios gave up. By that reading, the commander of the enemy front had decided to put his main effort somewhere other than Dak To. He would go on threatening the bases there, but the defenses between Ben Het and Tan Khan had thickened over the winter, and to the south, the line was thinner. The 1st Division had not made up what it lost in November. It had been given a fresh regiment from the north in place of one that had gone south, and that was all. Through March, the trails across the highlands filled again with men and loads, and the patrols saw small groups almost every day, and the groups were almost always gone before anything started. On the 20th of March, a new brigadier general took over the Airborne Brigade. 10 days after that, General Piers moved 3 of its battalions and the brigade headquarters out of Kontum province and down to the coastal plain, and left the 4th Battalion where it was. In the first days of April, the scout helicopters working out of Dak To began reporting more movement than before. 2 regiments of a division that had come down from the north were entering the area. It took them several weeks to learn the ground and to get their supply working. Because the high forest there was nothing like the country the division had trained over. The land itself came through all of it without any particular change. The road into the district was still the one road. It ran west from Tan Khan towards the border, unimproved, passable in dry weather, with detours where heavy vehicles could not follow it, and everything that came into that country by ground still came in along it. The Krong Poko still lay across the eastern side of the district, fordable in the dry season and a barrier the rest of the year. The forest still stood in tiers, and under it a man could still see a few yards. Somewhere out past the last of the fire bases, the 3 borders still came together, and there was still no line on the ground to show where any of them ran. And the hills kept their numbers. That is what a number on a map is out there. The height of the ground above the sea, measured once and written down. 823, 882, 1,338, 875. A height is not a thing that moves. Men went up those hills in November and came down again, and other men came back to the same country in the spring, and through all of it the figures on the map stayed exactly what they had been, because they had never been about anybody at all. They were about the ground. The last of the American units left the highlands that spring, and the ridges went back to standing in the weather. In the mornings the fog would come up out of the valleys the way it always had, and by the middle of the day, it would be gone, and the country would be open all the way to the border. Sleep well.